Hello everyone and welcome to today's Connect and Learn webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today or in the future. My name is Rebecca and I'll be facilitating today's webinar, The Experience of Families Affected by Another's Substance Use, an overview of treatments. This webinar is part of a series of Connect and Learn webinars designed to support AOD clinicians throughout Victoria, but we welcome everyone. This webinar series is funded by the Victorian Department of Health and hosted by Turning Point. We do like our webinars to be interactive, so please do ask questions, but please do so via the Q&A function, not the chat function. The questions will be collated by me and answered by our presenter at the end. Please be aware that our webinars are recorded and are later made available on the Turning Point website. We encourage you to stay to the end and complete the exit survey when the QR code appears on the final slide. We will also send you an email with the survey. Our presenter has kindly agreed to share a copy of the slides, so we will forward those to you via email. Today, I'd like to introduce our presenter Clare Rushton. Claire's joining us from New South Wales, which is great. Thank you, Clare. Clare is a clinical psychologist, a clinical registrar, currently working at Hunter Primary Care, providing psychological therapy to adults and adolescents with a range of mental health difficulties, including substance use and mood disorders, anxiety, trauma, anger, and interpersonal difficulties. Clare is completing her PhD at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales. Her research is investigating the experience of families affected by a loved one's substance use and how to effectively address families' needs through the intersection of research and clinical practice. Clare, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Rebecca, and thanks for having me along today. So as Rebecca said, I'm going to be speaking to you about the experience of families affected by another's alcohol and other drug use, an overview of treatment. Before we start, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we are all meeting from today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I want to extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. So here's a photo of beautiful Newcastle in New South Wales, where I'm joining you from today. And this is the traditional country of the Awabakal and Warramai people. So I also want to acknowledge the lived experience of the people in this area. So people with lived experience of mental health and alcohol and other drug issues, and recognise their contribution at all levels for the purpose of learning and achieving better outcomes in AOD research and practice. And specifically, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of the families with lived experience who I've had the privilege of meeting and working with as part of my own research and practice. So a little bit about me. So my name is Clare Rushton, and as Rebecca said, I'm a psychologist completing my clinical training at the moment. So I work at a not-for-profit primary care clinic in Newcastle. And as part of my work, I get to see people all across the age range with different presentations. But interestingly, one thing I've really noticed is the majority of people that I work with either had difficulties with their own drug or alcohol use or with a loved one's drug or alcohol use. So I'm also completing a PhD at the University of Wollongong, and my research is looking at just that. So these are the people who are affected by somebody else's drug use. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So here's a bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about. So to start off, we're going to cover the impact on families who are affected. And then I'll be speaking about the different types of treatment that are currently available for families. As part of this, I'm going to be touching on the different theories that each of these treatments are actually developed from. So next, I'm going to be sharing the results of a study that we conducted, which looked at the effectiveness of these treatments for families. And finally, we're going to focus in on one treatment in particular. I'm going to share the findings of a pilot study that we recently conducted. So as Rebecca said, there'll be time at the end for some questions. So just pop them in as you think of them into that Q&A function at the bottom. So drug and alcohol use has many direct but also indirect costs. And there are estimates that around 80 to 100 million families, friends, and significant others are affected by a loved one's substance use. So from here on, I'm going to be referring to this group just by the word families. So families experience higher levels of stress, anxiety, depression, and relationship breakdowns than the general population. And there's also added complexity when it comes to illicit drug use. There's a lot of stress around that antisocial behaviour and criminal activity that comes from acquiring these drugs. And there's often a fear for the safety of both the person that's using the drugs, but also for the entire family unit. And this is particularly relevant in Australia, where we have really high rates of methamphetamine use. So families often describe this experience of ongoing grief and loss at the expectations that they held for their loved one's future. So despite the harms being quite well documented, families have historically been neglected from services. And this is due to a number of different reasons, and I'll touch on these briefly now. So theories like codependency, these understand the family to be part of the problem and really contributing to their loved one's drug use. And this has really prevented services from involving families in the past and wanting to more kind of keep a distance and separate the two. There's also a lot of long-standing stigma and shame around substance use, which I'm sure we'll be familiar with our clinical practice as well. And this is perpetuated by the depiction of substance use and language often that's used in the media as well. So there is now, though, an increased awareness that families do actually play quite an important role in the treatment of alcohol and other drug use. And there's also an awareness that families actually require support as an independent population in their own right. So again, while the focus of addiction treatment in the past has been around the person using drugs, there are several family-focused interventions that have been developed. And these can be broadly grouped into three types. So firstly are the treatments that work with the family members to promote the entry and engagement of the person that's using substances into treatment. So the second group are around the joint involvement of family members and their loved one in treatment. So this might be like couples therapy and treatments like that. And the third one, which is represented by this little pink icon here, is all about responding to the needs of family members as a population in their own right. So I'm going to be using these little icons as a bit of a key throughout. So keep an eye out for the bottom right-hand corner of the slides. So I also want to note that these approaches and treatments that I'm going to be speaking about today are just the formal supports and programs that are most widely used and most researched. But I also want to acknowledge that there are lots of other informal support programs and call centres and things like that for families and friends that I won't be speaking about today. So next we'll be going through a bit of a timeline of some of these different treatments and making a link to the theory. And so when I say the word theory, what I'm talking about is really the set of ideas that's used to explain a pattern of behaviour or a phenomenon. And we'll be looking at how these different ideas about addiction and the family have influenced treatments. So one of the first treatments available to families was actually started by the wives of men who were attending Alcoholics Anonymous. So the wives would meet up to share their experiences while their husbands were in AA meetings. And this became known as Al-Anon family support groups. And these were formally established way back in 1939. So Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon family groups all follow what's called the 12-step program. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. And these approaches are actually based on the disease or the medical model of addiction. And this theory states that addiction is an incurable brain disease and that abstinence is the only option for recovery. So the 12-step programs also have a spiritual underpinning and the idea that the family are surrendering to a higher power. But they have increasingly moved away from that focus on spirituality to more focus on the mutual support components. So the 12-step family groups called Al-Anon and Nar-Anon. And in these programs, families are taught that their loved ones must hit rock bottom. And there's this real idea of hitting the lowest of low points before their loved one will kind of realise the extent of the issue and seek help. And the family are actually powerless over their drug or alcohol use. So it's about kind of giving up that control. So the 12-step approaches are the most widely used treatment for families, and the groups are run all around the world today. So Al-Anon and Nar-Anon groups have been seen to be effective, but it's quite difficult and has historically been quite difficult to do research on these groups because there's such a strong emphasis on anonymity. So I've got a quote here from Lois, and Lois was actually the wife that I mentioned earlier who started these groups way back in the early 1900s. So I might just read this to you now, and I just want you to have a think about the perspective at the time around the role of families, and maybe just jot down any thoughts you might have while I'm reading it. So one Sunday, Bill asked me if I was ready to go to the meeting with him. To my astonishment, as well as his, I burst forth with, "Damn your old meetings," and threw a shoe as hard as I could. This surprising display of temper over nothing pulled me up short and made me start to analyse my own attitudes. By degrees, I saw I'd been wallowing in self-pity, that I had resented the fact that I was left alone while he was off somewhere scouting up new drunks or working with old ones. I felt on the outside of a very tight little clique of alcoholics that no mere wife could enter. My life's purpose of sobering up Bill, which made me feel desperately needed, had vanished. I decided to strive for my own spiritual growth. So I think this really sums up the ideas that these groups were founded on. I think this idea where she speaks about self-blame and her own role in her husband's addiction. I think it's really interesting there where she states that sobering up Bill had been her life's purpose. I think this also kind of speaks to the neglect of self-care, which is seen a lot in families as well. So the next treatment I want to talk about is called the Johnston model. And the Johnston model works with families to help them stage an intervention or a confrontation with the person who is using drugs. So the purpose of this intervention is to encourage or persuade the person using substances into treatment. So the Johnston intervention is also based on the medical or disease model of addiction. But these interventions challenge the idea that we saw in the 12-step programs that one has to hit rock bottom before starting their journey of recovery. So by confronting their loved one through the steps of the Johnston intervention, which you can see laid out there on the right of the screen, the family is hoping to bring the rock bottom to the person that's using drugs or alcohol and move them out of this stage of denial before the damage of actually hitting that rock bottom can occur. So again, this was developed in 1960s, so quite a while ago now, and there is a little bit of research saying that it has been effective in getting people into treatment. But there's a lot of kind of ideas around it being quite confrontational, and it's controversial because of that. And there's thoughts that it also reinforces this idea of shame and stigma that people using alcohol and other drugs often feel. So the next treatment I want to introduce is called the Community Reinforcement and Family Training, or CRAFT. So CRAFT came a little later on. It was developed in the 1990s. And the initial design of CRAFT was to target people who refused to get help for their alcohol or drug use and to engage them in treatment. So the program was designed to be delivered across several different sessions with the families. And it's really focused on teaching families skills in communication, boundary setting, and how best to actually respond to their loved one and their loved one's behaviour. So CRAFT is based on the behaviourist theory, and this really focuses on the idea that the family's response to their loved one's addictive behaviour will either reinforce or discourage their relatives' addictive behaviour. So CRAFT is run both with individual family members, and it's also been run as part of a group program, and it's also been successfully run online. So I also want to come back to this. So this was one of the first papers describing CRAFT as an intervention, and coming back to that primary point that it is really focusing on engaging unmotivated drug users in treatment. So the five-step method was developed around 2009 to 2010. And this is a program for families independent of the person who is using alcohol or other drugs. So unlike the other treatments that we've talked about so far, the five-step method is based on the stress-strain coping support model. And you can see an image of the stress-strain coping support model down the bottom. So this model really suggests that caring for a loved one with substance use is a highly stressful experience and that families really require support in their own right. So this treatment is independent of the person that's using drugs. And the model suggests that with the support, with knowledge, the family members can actually develop the capacity to cope. So the five-step method takes a non-judgmental, non-directive approach. And on the right there, you can see the 5 steps of the program. And I'll just speak to these briefly now. So the first step is all about understanding the family's story. This is all about listening to them, reassuring them, normalising a lot of their distress and exploring their specific concerns. So step 2 is about identifying relevant and targeted information for the family. Step 3 is all about exploring different ways of coping and ways of responding to their loved one. The 4th step is about exploring and enhancing support and communication. And the final step is just reviewing the above 4 steps and looking at any further needs that might be needing to be met. So just want to pop these here. So Smart Recovery is an organisation that also has a group program for families, which is also based on the stress-strain coping support model. And I'll just be talking about this a little bit later, so keep that in mind too. So Family Drug Support is an Australian organisation founded in 1997 by Tony Trillingham. And the aims of Family Drug Support are to support the family in their own right. So they operate a 24/7 phone support line. They also run mutual support meetings and information sessions as well, which they call the Stepping Forward program. And they've got a flagship program called Stepping Stones. And this is an intensive group that's run over 2 consecutive weekends. So the program really focuses on helping families develop effective communication, coping skills, and teaches this idea of how to set workable boundaries. The focus there is all about on harm reduction. So Family Drug Support have also adapted a version of the stages of change model. And this incorporates the experience of families. Thinks about the family is going through their own parallel process of this stages of change model to the person that's using drugs. So the first step is denial. And this is all about this denial that this is actually happening to their families. And some families will sit in this state for quite a while there is some evidence kind of coming to light that their loved one is using alcohol or other drugs. So stage 2 is the emotional stage. And with this, there are often strong feelings of anger, there's an experience of grief, shame, stigma, and also a lot of guilt and blame around the family's role in their person's drug use. So stage 3 is called the control stage. And there are 2 approaches that are generally seen in the control stage. So the first is what's called the hardline approach. So this is where the family might put in things like ultimatums, and drug test their loved one. And the second approach is called the soft line approach. And this is this juggling act of trying to keep the peace within the family. So the 4th stage is called the chaos stage. And this is when we see blame within the family, a pointing of fingers, really strong feelings of overwhelm that maybe this is actually never going to end. And the 5th stage is what's called the coping stage. And this is where this really taps into that stress-strain coping support model again, where by providing education, information and support to families and bringing back this idea of self-care, which is often really being neglected, that you can rebuild trust and open communication. And again, that idea of setting workable boundaries that you can set up and live with realistically. And this also really focuses on letting go of that need to fix your person. So to summarise, so families have really been identified as an at-risk population. And most interventions and research that involve families have focused on how to use family members to support the person using drugs to either get into treatment or to abstain from use. There's been limited research really looking at the effectiveness of these treatments that are responding to the needs of families in their own right. Now I'm going to be presenting the findings of a systematic review and meta-analysis, which looked at the effectiveness of psychosocial interventions for improving outcomes for families. So the aims of the study were to synthesise literature evaluating the effectiveness of interventions, improving the wellbeing for family members. And the measures that we looked at included depression, anxiety, distress, improvements in quality of life, general functioning, and coping. So a systematic review is just a big search of all the peer-reviewed literature that's been published in journals to find all the studies that answer a certain question. So in our case, the question we wanted to answer was asking about the effectiveness of treatments for families. So the review that we conducted followed what's called the PRISMA guidelines, and these are just a standardised set of guidelines for best practice when conducting a review. So we developed a search strategy using words like family, substance use, and treatment. And we searched 5 different electronic databases for all the studies that were published between 2010 and 2020. So this here is called a PRISMA flow diagram, and it gives a good overview of the review process from the very top here, which was where we started developing that search strategy, all the way down where we narrow down the papers at the bottom here, which is the final papers that we included. I'll just talk you through this now. So once we'd run that big database search and removed all the duplicates that came up, we had 4,450 studies. So then we looked through all those studies, and 126 of them seemed to be eligible to answer our study question. So then the next step was reading these 126 studies in a bit more detail to see if they really did answer the question. And we decided that 108 of those weren't going to be relevant, which left us with 19. So these were 19 studies that were included in the review. So of those remaining 19 studies, 10 of them were able to be combined for what's called meta-analysis. And this just means combining all the numbers from the results sections together to give a much more powerful result. I'll talk you through what we found in the review now. So of the 19 studies that we included, 11 were randomised control trials and 8 were pre-post studies. The majority of the studies were conducted in the USA, followed by Iran, and there was only one study that was conducted in Australia over that 10-year period. So the majority of participants were Caucasian females whose significant other was using alcohol or other drugs. So 7 of the studies assessed programs that were delivered in a group format, and 11 were delivered to individuals. And 3 of these programs were run online. So the majority of studies evaluated CRAFT, which you remember we spoke about just earlier, followed by the 12-step interventions and the 5-step method. So of all the outcomes that were assessed by the study researchers, the most frequently measured outcomes were depression, distress, and coping, followed by family functioning and anxiety. And interestingly, substance use and physical health were only measured by 2 of those 19 studies. So here are the meta-analysis findings. So for the treatments that were delivered in a group setting, we found improvements on depression, distress, and coping, and these were all statistically significant. Of those treatments that were delivered in a one-on-one setting, we also found improvements in depression, distress, family functioning, and coping, which is also really promising. So I've just put here on the slide on the right here, this is called a forest plot, and this is how the data gets spat out when we do a meta-analysis. And if you have any questions about this later, feel free to ask as well. So as I spoke about before, the different treatments are all based on different theoretical underpinnings. So we talked about CRAFT, which was originally developed to encourage the person using substances into treatment. And this is compared with something like the 5-step method, which is all based on the stress strain coping support model. But interestingly, despite all of these differences, we saw a lot of common elements seen across all these different treatments. So there was a real emphasis on providing families with education, support, and coping skills. There was also a real push to promote behaviour changes and effective communication as well. Another thing that we saw come up was the highlighting the importance of self-care. And as we saw, a lot of those group programs, they all included elements of mutual support and collective problem solving, which we're also seeing to be a really effective element in these treatments as well. So of all the studies we included, there were also a few limitations to the study designs that I'll just talk you through now. And those really need to be taken into consideration when we're looking at the results. So risk of bias assessments are another step in this process of doing a systematic review. And this process involves two researchers going through all the studies that we're going to include at the end and assessing each study on a number of criteria. One of these might be, well, how the participants were selected, or how the researchers managed missing data, or something like that. So up here you can see the results of our risk of bias assessments. So 9 were rated as high risk and 10 were rated as moderate risk. There were also fairly small sample sizes and quite high dropout across the treatment. And the study participants were mainly middle-class Caucasian females, which again seems fairly consistent actually with the overrepresentation of women in caregiving roles. But we do know there are other populations who are affected by drug use. So the measures that we used, for example, a measure of depression, what we saw across different studies was that different studies tended to use a different measure to assess depression. So one might have used the DAS, the depression subscale of the DAS, while another might have used the Beck depression scale. So there was a real inconsistency there, which makes it quite difficult as well to compare these results. There were also only quite short follow-up assessments. Again, this makes it quite hard to know whether the improvements that families saw over the course of treatment were actually maintained over the longer term, whether family members went back to their sort of original functioning after a couple of months had passed. So interestingly as well, and I'm going to come back to this point I made earlier, that physical health and substance use were only measured by 2 of the studies. And I think if we reflect on our own clinical experience, that the stress that we know we know that when people are under stress, they are more vulnerable to using alcohol or other drugs as a coping strategy. So it's going to be important to start thinking about measuring this in families as well as measuring their own physical health and their own alcohol or drug use, because we do know that that is a big link between stress and substance use. So in conclusion of this review, it gives a summary of the recent literature, and it shows that both individual and group treatments demonstrate really favourable outcomes for families. So that's a really promising thing to find. There were quite a few limitations, as I've just noted, and there's a lot of room for some more good quality research, including with larger sample sizes, more consistent measurements, and some longer follow-up times as well after the treatment is finished. Okay. So moving on to the final section of my presentation, and this is looking at one specific example of treatment, the results of a pilot study. So I'll be presenting on the results of a study that we did that looked at Smart Family and Friends program, with the feasibility of an intervention for families and friends who are affected by another's methamphetamine use. So I'd also like to acknowledge the other members of the research team that were involved in various stages throughout this project. The study was conducted in partnership with Smart Recovery and was funded by the National Centre for Clinical Research on Emerging Drugs. So the Smart Family and Friends program was developed by Smart Recovery in 2009, and this was a treatment program designed to support families independent of their loved one or their loved one's drug use. So the program is based on cognitive behavioural principles, and it was later adapted to align with the stress strain coping support model. That understanding that caring for a loved one is a highly stressful experience and that families really require some support in their own right. So the goal of the program is to equip families with a toolkit of coping skills and harm reduction techniques. And it's designed to be delivered over 8 distinct modules. You can see there on the right of the screen. This is a breakdown of those 8 modules. So the first is around finding motivation to change. The second is looking at self-care, support and rewards. The third is looking at some psychoeducation around CBT. The fourth module is around assertive communication. Then it looks at doing some active problem solving and making better choices, coping with lapses, keeping safe and seeking support, and then some final goal setting. So as with many studies that were done during this time, it was done in the middle of the pandemic, so it had to be moved last minute to be delivered via video conferencing. And I think while at the time this was a pretty stressful experience for everyone, I think it was a really good learning point. And as you will see, we found some quite interesting results from this too. So the aims of the study were to assess the feasibility and outcomes of the SMART family and friends group for people affected by another's methamphetamine use in Australia. This was delivered via Zoom. So the data that I'm about to show you hasn't been published yet, so just please keep the results to yourself. That would be great. So this was a pre-post feasibility study, which used a mixed methods design. And this means that we use both quantitative and qualitative measures to assess the program. So participants were a self-selected convenience sample who we recruited online through the Smart Recovery Australia website. This was done between March and October of 2021. So to be eligible, participants had to be English-speaking Australian residents, and they had to be affected by another's methamphetamine use, had to be aged 18 years or older, and they had to have some kind of capacity to participate in the online format, so via their computer or a smartphone. So here are the results of the study. So the majority of participants identified as females over 50 years and were the parent of an adult child who was using methamphetamine. And I think it's quite interesting here. So the average duration of their loved one drug use was 11.6 years. It's quite a long time. So the results showed that the study was highly feasible. So it's a really good attendance rates of 73% participants were completing the follow-up measures. We also saw really positive scores on the satisfaction rating and really high fidelity ratings, which is really good too. So I'll just cut back there. So the way that we measured the effectiveness as well. So we got a few demographic measures, as I just presented here. We looked at attendance, but we also looked at a few measures that we conducted before people participated in the program, and we measured them again after the program. And I'll show you the results of these now. So we used the measures that we might be familiar with. So psychological distress, we assessed using the K10. And we saw really significant reductions in psychological distress for families after they completed the program. Another measure that we used was called the Family Member Questionnaire, and this was a measure that's been designed by a group over in the UK, and it's designed specifically to measure the experience of affected families, including things like the level of stress, the impact, the burden on the family member, and also their coping strategies. And we saw really promising findings on all of these, improvements in all of these measures after participating in the program. So again, I want to note that this study involved quite a small sample. So only 45 participants were involved, but nonetheless, this is really promising to see as a feasibility study. So I'm going to talk through some of the themes that we found. So another way that we measured feasibility, we got participants after participating in the program to do some telephone interviews. We had a bit of a semi-structured interview that was set up. And this just looked at asking them about their experience of participating in the program and whether they had any recommendations for things that they'd like to see change in the future. So firstly, participants reported that the mutual support component helped to reduce feelings of isolation. So here's a quote from one of the parents, Taylor, who was involved. And just feeling supported, even though they're people I've never met and don't know what they look like, half of them, it's a very powerful thing. I big support around you that you probably, until now, weren't aware how important that is. So another thing was actually the criticism of the online format. And this was around the difficulty connecting with other participants. I think this has been a bit of a thing that's come up for a few studies that have been run online. So no chance for a cup of tea before or after, or just having those incidental chats with people. And that was from Janelle, who was a significant number of somebody who was using methamphetamine. So participants also noted the convenience of the video conferencing delivery. Again, while it was harder to connect, they found that being comfortable in your own space kind of made sort of balanced out some of those negative side effects. The fourth thing here was that people really mentioned that the workbook was a really helpful resource both during the program and also after the program. So the workbook just stepped through each of those 8 modules, and there was space to leave notes, to set goals throughout, and space for other reflections. So I'll read you this quote here from Rachel, who was also a significant other that was involved in the study. The handbook is good. I like having that, especially because knowing things and acting on them are 2 different things. Having something there to remind you that, it's good for me. So this study really adds to the literature that demonstrates the benefits of providing treatment to families independent of the person that's using alcohol or other drugs. And this is really important because we know there is such a high burden and stress on affected family members, and there is really limited options for evidence-based treatment at the moment. So as I heard before, even though this was a small feasibility study, the results were really promising, and it's going to be important for future research to keep assessing the effectiveness of these programs on a bigger scale so we can actually see and during those longer follow-ups of these, so we can really see how helpful these are for families in the long term. So these findings really reinforce the needs of families and just show how necessary it is to keep providing treatment to support this group who have been at risk and historically neglected from services. So we've been through the background, we've kind of looked at the different treatments and the link to theory. We've looked at that systematic review and meta-analysis showing that treatments per family do look effective. And we've gone through that one specific example of the study as well. So I'll just summarise now what we've talked about. So historically, the focus of treatments has never really been on families. And while there are some programs now for families, as I said, there's limited research into how effective these are. It is promising to see that there are more treatments emerging. And I think, especially through places like Turning Point, kind of linking these families up with services that are already, the 2 people who are already engaged in alcohol and drug services themselves. And I think that supporting families independently is going to be really important, particularly as we're seeing these treatments to be more and more effective. So here are some resources for you if you're going to be working with families. And I think it could be helpful maybe to add some questions around speaking to families as part of your assessment when you're working with someone who's using alcohol or drug use, or maybe at your service having a flyer and out for them to pass on to their loved one as well. So I've got some services here, and I'll leave a copy of the slides accessible to people if they're interested. Thank you. And feel free to contact me via email if you've got any further questions as well.
Thank you so much, Claire. I do have some questions for you. So, I think we should have time for all of them, but we'll see how we go. But thank you, everyone. If you've got more questions, by all means, put them through. First one, Claire, is there a model appropriate for all types of addiction, including addiction to a person, for example, a toxic romantic relationship or a cult figure?
That's a really interesting question. So my research specifically has just looked at drug and alcohol use and the effect of that on families, but I think this is going to be a space that's going to be really important to keep looking into. What they've found, so this group over in the UK as well, they've looked at the impacts on somebody supporting a loved one with gambling addictions. And they found that a lot of the same treatments and the same models can apply fairly effectively. So I think that's a really, really good point, and definitely something worth looking into, these other kind of addictive behaviours that people have, and the strain on the support network around those people is definitely something that maybe we can start to apply some of these techniques to.
Thank you so much. Similar question, but about a different group. Is there a model for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander substance users and their families?
That's a really good question as well. So at the moment, there's not a specific model that I'm aware of specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I know they've done a few studies in Australia and looked at some other kind of cultural groups. I think also in India they've done some studies looking at supporting kind of different cultural groups within that country as well. And what they found in those studies was that families did seem to benefit from the things like the 5-step method as well. So going through that really structured approach of kind of listening to and understanding the specific concerns, and then providing information and support around effective coping strategies. And I think maybe that's where we need to be looking at how to be really culturally specific, is really understanding what the specific needs are for the person within the culture, within the context that they're in, and then looking at how to address each of those through the coping strategies that will be equally appropriate for that context too. So yeah, definitely a good question, and something I'm hoping to look into a little bit too.
Thank you. Is there any evidence for family therapy, family-involved therapy?
So I'm assuming, is this referring to families who are involved in their loved ones, in the person who's using alcohol or drug use?
I think if I'm going to ask this question, if you can clarify for me, and I'll put it to Claire again. Thanks, Claire. It's interesting to hear Iran had significant research publication. Why do you think that is?
I think that's a really, really good observation. And that was something I was really curious about as well, that seemed to have, second to the US, which was really, really interesting. I think there's been a fairly large kind of interest in, it was Iran and also India that wasn't represented in those studies, but there's been a little bit more research kind of prior to that time there as well. I don't have a specific answer for that, but one thing I think that is quite interesting is the cultural experience of somewhere like Iran, particularly for the women, just because we know the cultural oppression and there's kind of a lot of cultural differences there. But there's also much higher penalties for alcohol and drug use in countries like Iran. And so I think it's quite incredible as well that they were able to conduct the research in those places with those high penalties and those other kind of cultural problems or cultural differences as well. As to why that was, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm very interested in looking into that a little bit further as well. But yeah, very interesting, well noted.
Thank you. Are there any of the older models that you think should not be used?
That's interesting as well. I think, as we see often with a lot of drug and alcohol use and treatments that we can apply, I think we really need to give families the choice in what is going to work best for them. So I've personally worked with people that I kind of talked through these different options of what they might find helpful for them. And based on all kinds of different reasons, they've chosen one that will work for them, and that varies between people as well. I think it's also really important to know that because families might want to have a go at, say, a 12-step program, doesn't mean that is going to work for them for their entire kind of time that they're supporting their loved one. That might be something that they get a few kind of tips out of, a few ways of coping based on the specific support group that is around them at the time. Because I think a mutual support group is also quite varied based on the other people that attend. And so at one point in time, you might learn some things, then you might leave and come back a couple of years later and get some other kind of tips from there. So again, I think this is really down to what the family's personal preference is, and if it works for them, I think that's important. But just making sure that they've got the information about where these have come from and what they're likely to get out of them, I think will be important.
Thank you, Claire. A question from someone who I assume is from Al-Anon. How was the research on Al-Anon family groups conducted? We would welcome more research on the effectiveness of our program and are very happy to cooperate in research.
That's great to hear. Yeah, so the studies that they've done, they were trying to, I know there was one group who were trying to do quite large scale studies in the US, looking at kind of longitudinal studies. I can put a link to the paper, and if you like the one I think about, I can't remember the exact methods for it now off the top of my head, sorry. But a lot of it was, looking at kind of more longitudinal data. So they weren't able to get that sort of on the ground kind of conversations about what the experience was like just because of that. But that's great to hear that you'd be willing to participate in some more research as well.
Thanks, Claire. Sorry, someone's asked just if refer back to the first study that you spoke of. That was the one that was conducted over the 10-year period that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Sorry, they just want a little bit more information.
Okay, yeah. So this was about a systematic review and meta-analysis that was conducted?
Yes.
Yeah. So, if there's anything in particular that you'd be interested in, so the paper's actually been published in the most recent edition of Drug and Alcohol Review, and it's a free access publication. So I can actually send through a link of that as well with the slides. So feel free to go in and have a look at the paper in detail too. So around, I guess, the goals of the review, what we really wanted to look at was how effective these treatments were on outcomes for families. So I think I mentioned before, for something like CRAFT, what is often measured as the primary outcome is looking at how many people using drugs actually got into treatment. And so that is often that initial kind of marker is this treatment successful? Yes, 60% of people then went and sought out, were put into treatments after that. Whereas we wanted to sort of change the lens there and say families are involved in this. Let's look at what the outcomes specifically for them. Did this help reduce depression? Did this help reduce distress and increase their capacity to cope? And so that was really the focus of that study, was to look specifically on outcomes for families. I'm not sure if that's answered your question there, but feel free to get in touch with me as well, and I can send you a copy of the paper.
Thank you. In terms of your research, did the facilitator make a difference in people's experience of the program? Were they peer or professionals?
That's a really good point too, and I think the facilitator is really important. That role makes a really big difference in how successfully a group is run. We had a great facilitator for our group. They were a trained mental health clinician, and they ran all 5 of the groups that were run. So we had those 45 participants. They were broken into 5 groups with around 8 to 10 people in each group. So they were trained. They were a mental health trained clinician, but they also were trained to deliver that program through those 8 modules as well. And they had a separate facilitator manual that they went through as well as part of that delivery.
Thank you. Couple of comments. Thanks, Claire. Your research is very important, especially for raising the profile of family AOD work. Another one. Hi, Claire. Great presentation. Any findings or comments on the experience of younger siblings who can feel invisible or overshadowed by, the person, the other family member experiencing problems?
That's a really, really important population that I think has really not been looked at all, is that role of siblings. As far as I'm aware, there's not a lot of research there at the moment. I'm hoping, as part of my PhD, I'm going to be conducting a survey as well in the coming months, so keep an eye out for that. And that's going to be an Australia-wide survey that's looking at people with all different relationships to somebody using alcohol or other drug use. So hoping to spread that net really wide and try to capture the experience of people like siblings and just see how it differs or how it's similar to somebody like a parent or a significant other as well. Because I think we'll see some differences there in the relationship and in the experience as well.
Thank you so much. Another comment, the breakthrough family sessions are great. They've been running every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. for the past 5 weeks or so. So I would encourage people to check out their website if they're interested. Another question for you. Do you have any data about the indirect impact of family-focused interventions on their loved one's addiction?
So this is looking at interventions just for families and looking at outcomes on the person that's using. So to my knowledge, I that's not an area that I've really looked into specifically. Just as I've said, I've mainly kind of been looking at the experience for families independently. But I think there is a fair bit of research out there. So yeah, I'll have to have a little look myself as well.
Thank you so much. Do you think that the reason that there is scarcity of research is a result of the historical ideas that families are part of the problem?
It's a really interesting point, and I think I've thought about this a little bit too in the past, that there's this idea that families are this idea of codependency, enabling behaviour, all these kinds of terms that have been used historically. And part of me thinks that maybe that would have been a good reason to involve families a little bit earlier. If they were perceived as part of the problem, get them involved and get them helping the problem. But it kind of swung the other way, and it was more around this needs to be separate. I think that quote as well by Lois that I read before kind of highlighted that a little bit too, that historically this idea that they're off doing their thing, and it was quite siloed around the people that are using alcohol or other drugs, and then the family sort of left to kind of handle that themselves quite separately. So I can't remember what the question was there. I'm not sure if I answered it. I think you're muted, Rebecca.
Thanks, Claire. Thank you. No, that's fine. Thank you. Have you found any difference in participation for families and friends in urban and rural or remote areas?
I haven't found that myself yet, but that's again something I'm hoping to look into with this survey that I'm going to be conducting. I think something that's quite interesting and what we've seen in a lot of the literature is that the people who are generally involved in research, like the participants in these programs, are generally white, kind of over 50 years. I think my studies sort of represented that fairly consistently, and often women as well. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how we can start to tap into the other people that we know are going to be affected. So again, in rural, regional areas who have maybe not had access in the past, I think it's a great opportunity to be really embracing using these online formats as well. Because particularly in places that are really small, rural, remote communities, that idea of shame and stigma as a barrier. If you are going to go and join a mutual support group in your town and there's a town of a couple of hundred people, it's pretty likely you're going to know everyone in that support group. And I think that shame and barrier is going to be an additional barrier there. So I think that, the online format is going to be a really great opportunity to try and start to tap into maybe these other areas of this population that have really been neglected in the past as well.
Thank you, Claire. Do you have any suggestions for families if the loved one isn't making any headway in their efforts to remain abstinent?
This is really, really tricky. I would say jump into one of these programs, absolutely, because I think what you'll find is that this is a really common and shared experience among a lot of people that are trying to support someone with alcohol or drug use. And I think just normalising and getting that support and really tapping into where that shame and self-blame is coming in is going to be really important in just coming back to focusing on what you need to do to get through this as an individual.
Thank you. Some other recommendations from some of our attendees that family support is often available at local AOD catchments. and also to check out the Family Drug Support website for their Stepping Stones program in Victoria. Claire, what do you think is ideal in terms of treatment for families in the future?
I think normalising that families need help as well is going to be really important, and maybe having it as part of the AOD intakes. So if there is contact with the families as there tend to be with assessments or things like that, making sure that they're aware that there is help for them as well. And that I think would be really, really great. Services, as have just been mentioned by those comments and a few others made earlier, I think are really, really fantastic that they're starting to emerge. And those phone lines like Family Drug Support are really, really great as a starting point. They can often direct family members to treatments that are going to be available in the area, to support groups, to other information. So I think definitely we need to keep a broad range of options for family, because as we know, all families are different. People are different and they're going to have different needs. Giving that broad range will be really important, and also just making sure that families are aware of it and aware that they also have these needs that are probably not being met. That could be.
Thank you, Claire. Some more, resources and places to go. Gamblers Help provides free counselling and financial counselling for families and friends affected by someone else's gambling. And a recommendation in Victoria to check out Family Drug and Gambling Help at Shark. Sorry, I'm just trying to scroll through what I've got left here. Are there any other emerging models that you know of, Claire?
Not that I'm aware of at the moment, but feel free to send them through if you hear of any. I'd be really interested. The stress strain coping support model is sort of the main one that I'm seeing a lot of treatments being adapted to at the moment. But again, really curious to see what kind of happens in the future there.
Thank you. And is there, statistics or some research that suggests that maybe using a mix of models is, more or less beneficial?
And again, not that I'm aware of as far as specific research, but I know in other, if we're kind of looking at other treatments in the different populations, I think a mix of models, a mix of approaches is always kind of better to give people more options, just so that they can see what fits with them best. Again, what worked for somebody might not necessarily fit for someone else.
Thank you. Sorry. Someone's just commented the fourth Addiction and Family International Network Conference is next month. Training to professionals on craft and the 5-step model are included if anyone's interested. Probably, sorry, I'm just looking at the time. I've got one last recommendation in terms of the service. This is for those of you in Queensland, that there's Lives Live Well in Cairns, and in Queensland generally provides the breakthrough program for families and includes resources to work specifically with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Claire, one final question, and apologies to everyone if your question hasn't been answered. I think for the most part we've got through most of them. How do you support a wife or a children in the family if the husband with drinking issues outright refuses to engage in treatment or address the problem?
This is really difficult, and I think asking those questions around family and domestic violence as well, and just checking in on the safety is going to be the first protocol there. So harm reduction and managing those risks is going to be vital, and kind of working with the family just around problem solving that as well, but making sure that safety is prioritised as the number one.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Claire, for your time, and I can tell by the comments here that it's been really appreciated. Claire, again, is kindly going to share her slides, which we'll email to you in the near future. And Claire, if there's any other attachments that you want us to send, please forward them to me. But thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending.